So this is the fastest I've ever come up with papers to read. We've got this. I mean, this looks okay. Never done this. I haven't done law and philosophy in a long time, so might as well do that. So this is the paper for anyone out there. It will also be in the show notes later below. So what are we doing? What are we doing? And that means we've got new updated title. Gonna open? Oh no, don't do that. Opened in a new window. Didn't open in the same old window. Alright, so I gotta get rid of my ooh-woos. So, cool. And as always, please comment along the way. My first time reading, and I am definitely not a legal criminal law and philosophy person, so we will find out. Okay, so we've got Intervening Agency in Civilian Liability by Helen Frowe, but who seems to be in Stockholm. Intervening agency is used in two ways in the philosophical literature, both which are illustrated by bomb. Bomb. A designs a bomb. B builds a bomb. C, a British combatant drops the bomb on a German factory as part of Britain's war effort. In retaliation, G, a German combatant, drops a bomb on a British factory. Okay, so the British and the Germans are at war again, and they're blowing each other up with bombs. Some writers describe G's action as an instance of intervening agency between C's action and the destruction of the British factory. However, I take this kind of triggering of, but not providing a means for, someone else's action to be a morally distinct phenomena that I will not address here. Rather, I am interested in intervening agency of the sort that happens between A, B, and C, culminating in C's bombing of the German factory, that is, cases in which indirect contributing agents, here A and B, provide a means of bringing about an outcome of which C is the proximate or direct cause. From here on in, I use indirect contributors to identify those whose actions contribute to threats only if other agents later intervene in the causal chain. I use the term direct threateners to describe those who, like C, directly pose threats. Okay, so, like, in this case, like, your parents are indirect contributing agents to your entire life and therefore are indirect contributing agents to, like, your entire, all the things you do. So, like, your parents can be A and B and you're C, and therefore they have indirectly contributed to all the dumb and all the great things that you have done in your entire life. Okay. So, writing in this journal, the author continues, writing in this journal, Adam Hossein claims that I defend parity. Parity is non-combatants and combatants on an unjust side of a war are frequently on par with respect to their responsibility for threats posed by their country, and thus frequently on par with respect to their liability to being harmed. Parity undermines the widely held view that civilians are not liable to defensive killing in war. Hossein argues that we can reject parity if intervening agency bears on one's moral responsibility for an unjust threat. Hossein proposes weak intervening agency. Weak intervening agency is people bear less responsibility for harm the less proximate they are to a harm, and this weakened responsibility bears on their liability. You know, that kind of makes some sense. Like, the farther removed you are from something, the less you have anything to do with it, including all the good things and all the bad things. Hossein does not specify how diminished responsibility bears on liability. However, several Several remarks suggest that he takes their diminished responsibility to exempt indirect contributors from liability to defensive killing, rather than to defensive harm altogether. In this paper, I argue that intervening agency does not bear on a contributor's responsibility for a threat, and thus does not preclude indirect contributors being liable to defensive killing. If my arguments are sound, they also rebut the stronger view that intervening agency precludes civilians being liable to defensive harm altogether. Okay, so we're going to find out who's a civilian and who's not. So it's like, let's go clicky on this. So, who is a civilian? Questions. So we're going to find out who's a civilian. All right, so in section 2, author outlines, hey, Evolve Yourself, what's up? It's going okay. I'm a little stressed out in general, but I read a quick paper earlier on some philosophy of language, which probably interests very few people except for me. And now we're talking about this paper on civilian responsibility and who counts as responsible for like war crimes and stuff. So this is called intervening agency and civilian liability. So, papers are going okay. I hope you are well. And you missed earlier, I called everyone cute in chat. So if you're in chat, you're cute. It's something I learned from other streamers. Just call everyone in chat cute. In section 2, I outlined Hussein's proposal that intervening agency diminishes moral responsibility for an unjust threat, that repeated interventions increasingly diminish responsibility, causing some indirect contributors to fall below the threshold for liability to lethal defense. In section 3, I argue that this view wrongly distinguishes between morally identical contributors. Section 4 addresses the view that an indirect contributor can be liable to a defensive killing, but only if she either effectively controls a direct threatening agent or jointly perpetrates wrongs. I argue that this is either false, that is, it is not only in cases of joint perpetration that indirect contributors can be so liable, or we must broaden our account of joint perpetration in a way that will likely include many civilians. Section 5 suggests that the intuitions elicited by cases involving intervening agency are most plausibly explained by presumed differences in the foreseeability of harm and necessity of harming indirect contributors. Section 6 concludes. It's got a lot of big words in these papers today, though. I don't like that. All right, 2. Intervening agency. In earlier work, I argued that cases such as gun and coercion falsify the claim that intervening agency defeats liability to defensive killing. Gun. Gun means attacker tells friend that attacker is going to kill victim, but has lost his gun. Attacker nags friend to lend him a gun. Friend eventually tires of attacker's nagging and lends attacker the gun. Attacker tries to kill victim. Okay. So if you lend someone a gun and you know they're going to go shoot someone, I guess that's what the author is going to, start talking about. And coercion. Coercion is the German army captures a town. Nazi orders mayor to shoot citizen on pain of Nazi shooting a greater number of citizens, but not enough to justify killing citizen who would otherwise have lived. Okay, so imagine that in gun, victim can defend himself only by killing friend, and in coercion, citizen can defend himself only by killing Nazi. I argue that friend and Nazi are liable to defensive killing despite the intervening agency of the direct threateners. So, hence, intervening agency does not defeat liability to lethal defense. Okay, so like if someone's gonna kill you and you know it, they're gonna kill you, but you could stop them by killing them first. So are they liable to defensive killing? Well, even though there's like other people involved, you still would have to do it because the other people involved are going to get forced into doing bad things. But like you could take out like the cause of the bad thing, like the Nazi or the friend could be Yeah, so you could kill the person that owns the gun, or you could kill the Nazi, and that would prevent the person that's gonna harm you from doing anything, because that would remove the impetus of the actual the actual person that will attack you from attacking you. Okay. Hossein argues that weak intervening agency can reconcile the intuitive liability of friend and Nazi with the moral significance of intervening agency. According to this principle, intervening agency diminishes the responsibility of those further back in the causal chain. Yeah, like, can you blame your parents for everything? Probably not. Could you blame them for something still? Maybe. Hossein argues that the degree of diminishing is affected by both the number of interventions between a contribution and a harm and the strength of an intervener's agency. Hossein agrees that friend is liable to be killed in gun because the mere fact that I am slightly less proximate to the threat isn't sufficient to undermine my liability. Yeah, I mean, if you give someone a gun and with full knowledge that they're going to kill a person, the government's going to go after you. I think, like, that's pretty clear, and people think that that would be the right thing to do. Like, to go after the person that hands someone a gun with full knowledge that it's going to be used in a crime. Alright, but Hossein argues someone further back in the causal chain, whose contribution is followed by numerous interventions, might not be so liable. Hossein also agrees that Nazi is liable to be killed in coercion, but he argues this is partly because the mayor's agency is heavily compromised as a result of Nazi's coercion. This means that there is very little intervening agency between Nazi and the threat to citizen. Hence, it is unsurprising that the Nazis' responsibility is undiminished or very minimally diminished, and the case does not demonstrate that the intervening agency cannot reduce responsibility. Hossein suggests that in general, combatants' intervening agency is more potent than mayor's. Even though combatants act under orders, they are typically more than minimally responsible. Thus, their interventions have a stronger diminishing effect on civilians' responsibility than mayor's intervention has on Nazis' responsibility. And in general, there will be multiple intervening agents between civilians and the inflicting of harms in war. Not only rank and file combatants, but also politicians and military leaders, whose agency is yet more potent than combatants. Given these factors, civilians' responsibility will typically be much less than that of combatants. Civilians' responsibility will typically be much less than that of combatants. Yeah, because, I mean, if you're a civilian and you're just living your life, generally you're not going to go to it has nothing to do with the war. Like, you don't go after those people for the war crimes of the the foot soldiers who are, killing kids or whatever nowadays. Yeah, that's just what they're doing nowadays. But like the person on the street back in some faraway city, as long as they have nothing to do with it, you're not saying, well, they didn't commit that war crime. Now, maybe there's the argument currently that, like, your taxes are paying that soldier's salary, so maybe you should pull all your money out and not, pay your taxes at this point, because that is indirectly funding those war crimes happening. And that's sort of the economic argument that's being made nowadays in against Russia's banks. So, but like, this is the thing. Where is the civilian responsibility? Yeah, Evolve Yourself says, yeah, but that's such an indirect form of support, I don't buy it. That's fair. I mean, I don't blame, most of the people in Russia are just probably not, they're not supporting, like, any sort of, war crimes going on. I don't think they have any desire to be supporting anything like that. But, the argument is, like, could they be doing more? I mean, sure. Could they be doing less? Yes, also. But, it's part of the issue is that, like, the West has basically leveled economic sanctions, and so we want them to be more effective. So we're asking everyone to do their part in the economic sanctions, and so it's a bit of the Western strategy is to, like, say this sort of stuff, even if it's unrealistic in day-to-day life. I can't see how any non-very involved Russian would be able to create an economic problem in Russia that would be significant, but I mean, the West can, encourage them, I guess. So. Anywho, continuing. Yeah, but I mean, it makes sense. Like, you're just some school teacher out in like, just like teaching math out in the middle of nowhere in Russia. What do they have to do with war crimes? Like nothing. They're teaching math. So okay, continuing, and feel free to ask more questions as per usual. Of course, both Hossein and I grant that mere differences in responsibility do not entail differences in liability. Hossein's arguments hold that the intervening agency diminishes responsibility, but indirect contributors cease to be liable to a defensive killing only at a certain point in the agential chain. Until this point, then, indirect contributors are less responsible than more proximate contributors and direct threateners, but still liable to be killed. Yeah, so if you kill someone in defense, where is the liability, I guess? Like, when do you get to act? I don't know. Alright, so given this, Hossein's framing of parity in terms of equal responsibility underpinning equal liability is a bit unhelpful. My argument for civilian liability does not depend on the claim that civilians and combatants are on par with respect to their responsibility for the unjust threats of war. It requires only that civilians are sufficiently responsible for those threats to ground liability to defensive killing. And thus, what Hossein must show, then, is not that intervening agency produces differences between civilian responsibility and combatant responsibility, but rather that intervening agency typically diminishes civilian responsibility to the extent that it falls below the threshold for liability to defensive killing. Okay, so if, like, someone's attacking me, then if there's, like, people that are involved, what does that have anything to do? Like, the author is asking, what does it have anything to do if someone's attacking me and I have to, like, stop getting attacked? Who cares all the people that are intervening in it? In some sense, that is irrelevant to my ability for self-defense. And that's what the author is saying here. Even though, like, there's liabilities and, like, responsibilities get changed, there's a certain a spot where it doesn't really matter anymore. I have to be able to defend myself, and at that point, my liability for a defensive killing, as soon as I get over that, like, I'm allowed to, defend myself. Okay. Notice that for weak intervening agency to support civilian immunity to defensive killing, it cannot be a purely retrospective claim. That is, it cannot hold that one's responsibility diminishes only once others have intervened and one's contributing lies in the past. If that were true, civilians would, at the time they make weapons and other goods, be fully responsible for the harms that their contributions will later bring about. At this point, there would have to be no interventions further down the chain to diminish their responsibility, because they will be the current end of the causal chain. Rather, the principle must also hold that the fact that getting from the making of the weapons to the inflicting of harm requires prospective interventions diminishes someone's responsibility at the time she makes her contribution. On this view, an IED maker's liability at the time she makes the device is undermined if getting the IEDs into the ground where they will later kill people requires multiple future interventions by other responsible agents. Yeah, so if you're making things like IEDs, just because more hands touch them along the way before they get to the battle zone, that doesn't diminish what you have done by making an IED. An IED is an improvised explosive device. It's like, it's kind of like a homemade landmine, I guess you could say. So, yeah, once you make the IED, and of course, on the other hand, say you truly believed you were making landmines in a defensive capacity, like you thought you were defending your homeland by making these bombs, and then all of a sudden, the dictator changes their mind and we're going to go to war against people who don't deserve to be blown up. So then what's your responsibility? And that's the thing. This is what the author is saying here, is that you have to kind of realize what you're making at that time, but like it doesn't matter like how many hands are in the thing along the way. In some sense, what you've done is what you've done. It doesn't matter how many people got like intervened in between. Like if 10 more people, like the thing got traded back and forth a bunch of times before it actually hit war zone. Okay. So 3, intervening as diminishing responsibility. Consider fuel. A group of 10 people, A through J, discover a tiny fire in a house that is about to burn out. They decide to make it a big fire. They stand in a line, passing long logs down the chain. A, the last in the chain, throws a log on the fire. Each of A through J knows that the owner is trapped in the house and the owner will be killed if the fire reaches a certain size. Killing any one member of the chain will prevent the fire from passing that threshold. Owner can save her own life only by killing one of A through J. So I guess it's like the owner's upstairs and these people are making a fire below her, and so she could like drop a log on someone's head and prevent them from making the fire fast enough to kill her. I could see that. Evolve Yourself says, so one's knowledge about the purpose of a product is a determining factor in how one who creates the product will be judged. I think so. I think that's part of the issue here, is that you have to realize what you're up to. Or it's not so much the knowledge, it's that you have responsibility for what you do. And so it doesn't matter. That responsibility is not dependent on how many hands, like certain like causal chains after that don't really matter. It doesn't matter how many, like if you make an AK-47, like Mr. Kalashnikov makes the AK-47, the man is responsible for the gun. Now, those guns have gone all over the world, done many, many, many things. It's the most famous gun in the world. It's on national flags. Now, Kalashnikov is, of course, he's a gun manufacturer. He's a gun creator. Now, is he responsible for all the things the guns do? No, but he knew he was making a gun. Like, he knew that. But, like, he was responsible for as a gun maker. I don't know about knowledge, but, like, you're still, like, knowledge is definitely part of what you're doing. Now, there's always the, I didn't know, I was just following orders sort of thing. And people say that all the time. That, like, I did not know what I was doing. I was just, following orders. And I was doing my one little bit in this war. And I had no idea that this was how it's getting used. And, that's kind of effective sometimes. And sometimes it isn't. Yeah. Alright. Yeah, I don't know enough about this stuff, really. So, yeah. According to Hossein, A is distinctively responsible for the fire, and the responsibility of each contributor progressively decreases as we move from A up the causal chain to J. But it strikes me as implausible that the owner has a special reason to kill A rather than any other indirect contributor, or that she may not kill any of the indirect contributors, or that she may kill B or C but not H or I. Yeah. Excuse me. Thinking about fuel suggests that allegedly minimal nature of... Thinking about fuel, that's where... Oh no, I forget what fuel is, whatever. Thinking about fuel suggests that the allegedly minimal nature of Mayer's agency and coercion... Oh, this is fuel. Does not even partly explain why Nazis' liability persists in the face of Mayer's intervention. And so, yeah... If there's all these people intervening, but like it's really the Nazi that's controlling the whole situation, it's the Nazi that's the problem, not the people that are, under that are being coerced into doing bad things, or at least less responsible. Mayer's minimal agency might help to explain the moral worseness of killing Mayer than killing the Nazi, although this could also be explained by other morally significant differences between them, for example, that Nazi is more deserving of harm, or that Nazi wrongs Mayer by coercing him. But A's agency is not minimal in fuel, and yet each of A through J is not only liable to defensive killing by owner, but also, I suggest, equally responsible for the fire, irrespective of their position in the chain. When we hold other things equal, intervening agency is morally irrelevant. But according to weak intervening agency, responsibility diminishes as we move up the chain. G is less responsible for the fire than F. And for this to support the claim that some indirect contributors are not liable to defensive killing, there must be a point in the chain at which responsibility is so diminished that the earliest contributors cease to be liable. And that's why this thing is like, who is a civilian here? Because this is exactly what this I was thinking this author was going to do, is that they're going to move from the like people on the ground in war all the way up the causal chain to the civilians. Evolve Yourself asks, does it matter about the part of the weapon that one creates? That is, if one is responsible for putting a decal on the weapon, should that individual be held to the same level of accountability as one who creates the trigger? That's a good question. I think like this author would have something to say about that. I don't know. Like, I mean, if you were putting like the little thing that says where the safety is, that says like the decal says like safety on, safety off. I mean, there's a that's a really important part of the gun too. And so like, what does the decal actually do? I mean, is it just saying like, are we just talking about like, just the label of the manufacturer, or are we talking about something that says, this is how to fire the gun? So it depends maybe on, I get your point though, that like you're saying some irrelevant part, like some design feature versus some like critical feature. I don't know. Yeah, just the manufacturer's label, like Heckscher Koch or something. I don't know. I would say actually that basically once the gun is ready to leave the factory, then that's like they're all lumped together. That's the manufacture process. That's how I would do it. I would say, look, anyone in the manufacture process is that's part of the manufacture process. And so like, is it some idiot who's just putting a sticker on it? Or are they equally responsible as the person who makes the triggers? I don't know, because I mean, frankly, is this a skill job? Are you the only person that can make the trigger? Or is this just someone, like on a press going like this every 3 seconds, and it could have been any of them? And I think that's kind of the point of this A through J. You're trying to make it seem like, well, A is more important than J because they're doing a more critical role here. And I think the author here is saying, look, as long as they can be switched out with any of the other ones, then all of them have equal responsibility. Yeah, is one of those a skill job more important? It would seem that the one who's doing the skill job would have more responsibility because they're like, in some sense, they couldn't be replaced if they walked off the line. I don't know. I just don't know. Like, hopefully we'll see what the author has to say in a few pages. I mean, we're about halfway through the paper. Okay. Hossein doesn't, yeah, but interesting question, yeah. Hossein doesn't speculate as to how much intervening agency suffices to defeat liability to lethal harm. That is, at what point does a point in the chain the contributors cease to be liable? Yeah, so in this question, like, does the decal sticker, are they not liable for the gun? Because the gun is already functional at that point. Of course, we might think it unreasonable to ask for anything specific. Lots of moral thresholds are vague. But this doesn't make it any more plausible that, for example, G is less responsible for the fire than F. We might also suggest that this chain isn't long enough for anyone to avoid liability. But the number of interactions necessary for defeating liability cannot be much higher than 9 if weak intervening agency is meant to support widespread civilian immunity. Indeed, 9 may already be too high to rule out many civilian contributors. One of the main difficulties of relying on intervening agency to support civilian immunity is that the number of agential interventions between civilian contributions and killings will vary significantly, and there's no reason to think that this number will always be very high. Yeah, and so they're doing the 6 degrees of separation right here. That basically you're probably going to be dealing with a non-military person at some point pretty quickly in any causal chain, just because that's the nature of how things are in our world. We deal with lots of people, and not all of them are going to be in the military. So they're doing that. Now, this does not answer Evolve Yourself question about, are some people more important than others in this causal chain? Okay. Author says, I think that weak intervening agency is decisively undermined by comparing fuel with circle. The same group of 10 people as in Fuel, A through J, discover a tiny fire in a house that is about to burn out. They decide to make it a big fire. They stand in a circle, each throwing logs on the fire. Each of A through J knows that the owner is trapped in the house, and the house owner will be killed if the fire reaches a certain size. Killing any one of the members of the chain will prevent the fire from passing that threshold. Owner can save her life by killing one of A through J. In Circle, no, that's the end of the scenario. In Circle, each member of the group poses approximate threat to owner, and Hussein's view will pronounce each of A through J liable to defensive killing. But whether B through J are liable to defensive killing, and thus whether owner may kill them, cannot depend on whether they arrange themselves in a line or in a circle in order to burn down the house. If so, weak intervening agency is false. And this is what I was saying before about, like, once you can switch the order of them, and that's what the circle shape does, because any one on the circles, basically, there's no more order at that point, then, once you can switch out the people, then all of them are equally liable because they're all sort of interchangeable with each other. Okay. The exception for joint perpetrators. Adil Ahmad Haq argues that those who indirectly contribute to unjust killing rather than directly killing do not violate duties of sufficient stringency to render them liable to defensive killing. Haq claims that when someone unjustifiably breaches a duty, her liability is limited to the cost that she was initially required to bear rather than breach that duty. And he argues, whilst we ought to bear lethal costs rather than kill innocent people, we need not bear lethal costs rather than indirectly contribute to the killing of innocent people. So, like, someone in the gun factory should lose their job or something for making the gun that killed innocent people, but they shouldn't lose their life. So it should be, scaled to their responsibility level or something. Okay, since an indirect contributor is not required to bear a lethal cost rather than to contribute to an unjust killing, she cannot become liable to lethal defense if she justifiably contributes to that threat. The fact that one is an indirect contributor thus precludes one's being liable to defensive killing. Yeah, diminished culpability. That seems like what is going on here. However, Haq grants two exceptions to this rule, arguing that a person can be liable to defensive killing if she either indirectly threatens through the actions of someone she effectively controls or jointly perpetrates harm by acting with others. For example, Haq will pronounce Nazi and coercion liable to be killed because Nazi threatens through Mayor, controlling Mayor like a tool. Haq suggests that military commanders are also liable on these grounds, since the combatants who do their bidding are committed to following their orders and thus can be manipulated by them. However, combatants together undertaking a combat operation are joint perpetrators of the harms they inflict. For example, someone who drives the van for an ambush is liable to defensive killing for the sake of those whom she helps threaten, even though she will not directly kill anyone because of her integral role in a coordinated military operation. And I think this is where we're getting closer to what you were saying, because the integrated role thing seems like the sticker on the gun is not integrated, the trigger is integrated into it, like the gun being effective. One response to the fuel case that we discussed in 3 then could be to say that all the contributors, direct or indirect, are joint perpetrators of the fire and of threat to owner, and the moral significance of intervening agency is defeated in case of joint perpetration. Yeah, the salient factor, as you say, that, yeah, it seems like we're going in that direction now. This explains why each contributor is liable to lethal defense without undermining the significance of intervening agency in the absence of joint perpetration. This is roughly how David Rodin tries to secure the liability of all combatants, claiming that their unity of intent and role in institutionalized chain of command makes them liable to defensive killing, even if they are not proximate threats. In the case of civilians who aren't joint perpetrators, however, intervening agency will diminish their liability. Perhaps weak intervening agency can be modified to exclude cases of joint perpetration, enabling it to accommodate fuel. I doubt that only those indirect contributors who are joint perpetrators can be liable to defensive killing. Consider informant. Informant is, Albert realizes that his neighbors are concealing Beth, a Jew, in their attic. Nobody else suspects this. Albert plans to tell the Nazi authorities, who will raid the house in order to send Beth to a concentration camp where she will be killed. Beth can prevent Albert's informing on her only by killing him. Albert is not directly threatening harm to Beth or controlling the Nazi officers, nor does he jointly perpetrate harm. He will not be part of the raid, and to inform is not to be part of a coordinated military operation. And yet I find it deeply implausible that Beth may not kill Albert to save her own life. It seems equally implausible that Beth may not kill Albert after he has informed on her, if doing so will enable her to escape the Nazis. Okay, so yeah, I don't know about this actually right here. Because there was a whole Nazi party, and there was a whole society and culture and all sorts of stuff. So the idea that he wasn't part of a coordinated military operation, no, but he was part of the Nazi, might have been a Nazi party member. There was a whole lot of other stuff going on, and so there was definitely coordination of some of a sort. So, I mean, that's one thing to keep in mind. How coordinated is the society at that point? Okay, if Albert is liable to be killed, it cannot be true that only those who indirectly contribute, of those indirect contributors who act through others by controlling them or who jointly perpetrate harm, can be liable to defensive killing. Informant also gives us further reason to doubt that Hussein's claim that repeated intervening agency defeats liability. There will be multiple interventions between Albert's informing and harm befalling Beth. For example, Albert will speak to the desk officer at the local Nazi Party headquarters, who will pass Albert's information on to someone else, who will pass it to a superior officer, who will then decide whether to act on it, who will then order others to carry out the raid, who will then capture Beth, who will then hand her over to people who will put her on a train, which will take her to a concentration camp. All these interventions take place before Beth even gets to the camp, at which she will eventually be killed. Nothing about these interventions makes me think that Albert is not liable to be killed to save Beth. If Albert is indeed liable to defensive killing an informant, we must either deny that indirect contributors can be liable only if they contribute or jointly act with direct perpetrators, or broaden our account of joint perpetration to include someone like Albert. Perhaps knowingly playing this role in the threat to Beth suffices to make Albert a joint perpetrator. But any account broad enough to include Albert as a joint perpetrator is also going to include many civilians. If providing information that results in unjust killing is enough to make one a joint perpetrator, providing weapons and other material goods to carry out an unjust killing should also suffice. And this seems right. It's the old thing, it's the old, what's it called? Loose lips sink ships. And so this is the sort of thing, like we are all involved in war in some sense. Like people know things even in civilian life that are related to war, because it takes a whole society to mobilize to really do anything like this. And so this is the question: is who exactly counts as not being part of society at that point in times of war? And I think the author has a point. Like, it's very hard to just say, oh, Albert doesn't count because Albert was a civilian, was just telling the authorities. But if you include perpetrating them, then like a lot of people are going to be. If you include someone like Albert as being a joint as being a joint perpetrator, then that's going to include a lot of civilians anyway. Or if you don't, then either way, it's going to include a lot of civilians. So, all right. So, debunking intervening agency. I suggest that, and also, since people are here, let me know how you like my overlay with being able to write on it, like my little telestrator. I kind of like this. I don't know if other people do, but I like it. Debunking intervening agency. I suggest that cases that seem to support the moral significance... Oh, you dig it? Nice. I suggest that cases that seem to support the moral significance of intervening agency are, in fact, best explained by either variations in the foreseeability of a threat's eventuating. All right, so this is the knowledge claim again. So we've got the epistemic thing right here, foreseeability, or in the necessity of using force to avert that threat. As I argue here, being properly sensitive to foreseeability and necessity debunks the alleged significance of intervening agency. Foreseeability. Consider Hussein's example of a gun that passes down a long chain of people until it reaches the killer. I suggest that the intuition that those further up the chain are not liable to defensive killing is partly explained by the assumption that those contributors simply don't know or are less able to predict. So we've got epistemics, less able to predict what they're contributing to. Like, if you make a gun, it could be used to defend the country, it could be used to attack someone else. You don't know where the gun's going to end up. The person working on the gun counter at Walmart who sells a gun that is eventually used in an armed robbery is in a different epistemic position than the person who lends it specifically to the robber to be used in the robbery. On the assumption that one's epistemic position affects one's moral responsibility, the decreasing foreseeability that one is contributing to a threat plausibly bears on one's liability. Of course, we don't require certainty that one poses or contributes to a threat for liability, but plausibly it matters whether a harm is foreseeable upshot of one's actions, which might vary depending on one's account of foreseeability. Yeah, and this is why we have laws against, giving guns to people who have, like, criminal records and, like, certain mental problems, because it seems like there's a chance or there's a foreseeability that they're going to do something dangerous with a weapon, and we then take away their right in this country to have arms. So this foreseeability, I mean, was kind of enshrined, I guess, in the U.S. Like, once you do certain things, you lose the right to bear arms, even though everyone in the United States gets that as part of, the Bill of Rights here. Indeed, we might think that the length of a causal chain necessarily bears on foreseeability if we assume that the higher the number of necessary interventions between a contribution and an outcome, the less likely that outcome is to occur. Yeah, so if, like, you're making, like Evolve Yourself said, if you're just making stickers, you didn't realize that the sticker is going to go on a gun, maybe, and then, like, that, it's harder and harder to see how that is going to cause a problem. But if you're making triggers, then it might be foreseeable that someone's going to use a trigger to shoot somebody. So, like, maybe you were making bomb fuses or something like that. Then there's only one reason to use a bomb fuse. Like, you're going to make a bomb. So, okay. For example, Sanford Kaddish argues that the intervention of a second actor whose action is required for the harm to occur reduces the probability that the harm would ultimately happen. So, if so, contributors at different points in the chain cannot predict with equal confidence that their contributions will help to bring about the outcome. Thus, it seems that an increasing number of interventions must produce a corresponding decrease in foreseeability. Note that this would not make intervening agency significant for responsibility per se. It would still be foreseeability doing the moral work. But if intervening agency necessarily decreases foreseeability, intervening agency could nonetheless be a proxy for a decreased responsibility. Yeah, I don't think this is going to work because, like I said, you could, like, trade a gun back and forth 15,000 times, but, like, that sort of, like, trading a gun back and forth does not actually, that number of connections doesn't really do anything for the gun maker to begin with. Okay. See what the author has to say. However, I doubt that the intervening agency does necessarily decrease foreseeability. On the contrary, increasing the number of people who contribute to an outcome can decrease the burden on each participant, making her more likely to do her share, and thus increase the foreseeability of the threats eventuating in harm. Consider, for example, how multiple intervening agents carry a baton in a relay race can increase the likelihood of the batons getting from the start line to the finish. One runner alone might not make the distance. 4 runners, one intervening after the other to carry the baton, increase the chances of the outcomes occurring, that is, of the batons crossing the finish line. Thus, further instances of intervening agency cannot necessarily diminish foreseeability within a causal chain. And, this makes sense. Like, if you're making a gun for the U.S. military, you have a very good high confidence that the gun's going to be taken care of and it's going to be put in the hand of someone who knows how to use it. Now, granted, we may not, well, what am I saying? The U.S. is not going to be at war. Of course we're going to be at war. That's what we do. But, like, the idea that it's actually going to shoot anyone, you don't know that. But the idea that, like, if you're making guns for the U.S. military, it is going to end up in someone who knows how to shoot's hand. Like, that's... Like, there's going to be a lot of people that contribute to that. Yeah. There's a reason why this is an 18+ stream. Continuing. It also seems unlikely that longer causal chains requiring more interventions are in general less likely to eventuate in harm or threats of harm than shorter causal chains that require fewer interventions. Foreseeability depends on a wide range of factors, such as the degree of contributors' commitment to the end, and will not consistently decrease with increased interventions. That more people are committed to bringing about an end may increase each agent's resolve to do her bit, thus making the outcome more likely than if she acted alone or as part of a shorter causal chain. Yeah, and this is what I'm saying. If like you're part of the U.S. military, like this is what is going on right here. You've got a lot of people working very hard to get that gun into the hand of someone that's going to use it. Now, if you are part of, of some like small military faction, every person has to act on their own, but and there might be a very short causal chain, but like, in some sense, if anything breaks down and there's a much higher likelihood of breaking down, then nothing happens because everybody was kind of like, it was important that everybody does their part and there's no fallback at that point. But if you're in the U.S. military, there's fallback and like there's checks on checks to make sure everything is working. Not in the Russian military, apparently, though. Of course, we might have a threshold for when a harm counts as foreseeable for the purposes of grounding liability. This is something that liability theorists have discussed at some length. But this discussion need not detain us here for two reasons. First, it is not unforeseeable that the guns, bullets, and other items that civilians make in munitions factories will be used to kill people. On the contrary, killing or threatening to kill is the point of these items, and the chances that they will be so used are plausibly high enough, or at least in nearly all actual wars, for this foreseeability to ground liability. And I want to be clear, in America, people just like owning guns, like they do. And so a lot of the guns that we're selling here, they're not going anywhere. They're just going into people's like houses, and they're not going to be used. So it's like, my comments only really apply to the U.S. military stuff, like military contractors, not like these, retail people who aren't actually shooting at people. They just like guns. I get that. Moreover, many civilians do not merely foresee that their contributions will aid their combatants' military efforts, but also intend that they do so. And I doubt that differences in foreseeability matter when one intends to bring about an outcome. Consider bullets. Enemy wants to kill victim. All 6 chambers of enemy's gun are loaded. The gun is heavy, so enemy takes out a bullet. He points the gun at victim and pulls a trigger, killing victim. Enemy knows that he is less likely to cause victim's death once he removes a bullet. It is thus less foreseeable that victim will die. But it is implausible that the enemy is now less responsible for victim's death than he would have been had he not removed the bullet. It might even be enough for liability that one hopes that one will bring about an outcome, even if one believes that the chances of success are tiny, and thus one cannot be properly said to intend the outcome, assuming that an agent's intending to bring about an outcome requires her to think that there is a non-negligible chance of the outcomes occurring. Thus, there are reasons to doubt that intervening agency necessarily or even generally affects foreseeability, and to doubt that such an effect could support widespread civilian immunity. Yeah, I mean, basically it's the loose lips sink ships thing. If you're in a wartime scenario, the idea is that everyone is part of the thing, and just because you're a civilian, you're still supporting like the wartime effort. So now again, there is some removability here, but how you could still be somewhat removed from the wartime effort as a civilian, but certain industries can't quite make that. Like if you're in, you're making bullets, you can't quite say that I'm removed from that. I mean, if like I said, if you're teaching math out in the middle of nowhere, chances are you're not going to be it's not the same thing. All right, necessity. Our intuitions about the permissibility of harming civilians might also reflect familiar worries about preventative force, that is, force used before a threatened harm is imminent. Roughly, the more nascent a threat, the less confident we can be that force is necessary to avert it. This doesn't matter when we're thinking about harming indirect contributors to a threat that is now imminent, of course, but it could make us cautious about the use of force against, say, an IED maker. Perhaps the members of the militia will be captured before they have a chance to lay the IEDs. This suggests that the fact that the IED maker's plan requires the intervention of other agents affects the permissibility of harming her. Alright, so can you go after the bomb maker if, in some sense, you know that the other people won't have a chance to put the bombs down? author says, but again, this doesn't show the significance of intervening agency as such. What does the moral work here is the probability of the threats eventuating in harm. We can see this by noticing that the same concern arises in cases of non-imminent threat posed by a single person. Say the bomb maker will lay the device herself, but first needs to drive to the right place, which will take her several days. If there's no increased risk connected to waiting until she arrives and starts laying the device, then here too we ought to wait in cases where she changes her mind or is otherwise thwarted. But there's no intervening agency that could explain this requirement not to kill her at the point when she makes the devices. Intervening agency can affect the probability of a threat's eventuating, but this does not mean intervening agency necessarily diminishes moral responsibility. Rather, this is just an instance of the general truth that the lower the chance of a threat's eventuating, the less likely force is to be necessary. This bears on the permissibility of harming a person to avert a threat, but it does not bear on her responsibility for posing that threat. And as we saw above, intervening agency can also increase the chance of a threat's eventuating in harm by decreasing each person's contribution, making contributing less burdensome. And again, thinking about the probability of a threat's eventuating seems unlikely to provide general protection for civilians contributing to unjust wars, since the chances that civilians will in fact contribute to unjust threats will often be very high. You know, it's like, okay, so like, just because it's low likelihood doesn't mean that you aren't providing a threat. Like, if you're making bombs, you're making bombs. And the chance of them getting to where they want to be, you know, that might decrease in likelihood depending on the scenario, but you're still the bomb maker. In some sense, the bomb is originating with you. And so it seems like that. Now, the question is, it does seem like there is some sort of, people use this a lot, actually. It's like, oh, I didn't, it isn't my fault that, like, this is like healthcare in the U.S. It's like, oh, like, yeah. It's like not our fault that all these people got sick. It's like, well, we didn't do anything. It's like, well, that's not true. It's like you definitely contributed to like poor health in America by, having like allowing for pollution, causing asthma. And then you get like a whole swath of people and you're like, well, is that the business's fault for causing? It's like very hard to, let's just go with cigarettes. Like, did the cigarettes cause cancer? Not all the time do cigarettes cause cancer. Do they cause cancer sometimes? Yes. But that's the thing. If you're making a bomb, you might not always blow up anybody, and then it's like, well, that's a thing of chance. But if you're a cigarette maker, are you going to cause cancer? Not always, but sometimes yes. And so is that responsibility still with the cigarette manufacturer? In this country, we've like agreed that yes, it is in some sense their problem, especially when they lie about it. But like that's a different thing. But like, can you still go after the cigarette makers? And yeah, of course you can. You can sue them for lying to you about the harm. And same thing here is the bomb maker in some sense. Oh, they're saying, well, it's other people that lay the bomb. Or like, is it someone else that pulls the trigger? Yeah, but in some sense, just because it's someone else that did it, and if the person making the gun had full knowledge of that it was going to be used to harm someone innocent, then you could say, well, you had full knowledge of it. That was the foreseeability thing. And they also, if they're necessitating it themselves, it's the same thing here. So like they're going about and shooting people themselves. So, okay, conclusion. And yeah, there's the end of the paper. I have argued that intervening agency does not bear on a person's liability to defensive killing. Thus, we cannot rely on agential interventions between civilian contributions and unjust harming in war to support the view that civilians cannot be liable to defensive harm in war. Rather, as I have argued, it is plausible that our intuitions about the non-liability of indirect contributors track assumptions about foreseeability and necessity rather than intervening agency. These assumptions provide little support for the claim that civilians contributing to unjust wars enjoy widespread non-liability to defensive killing. Okay, so what's cool about this is I think this is right. Like, it doesn't really matter what the causal chain is, because, the causal chain here this is kind of like arbitrary how we think of like causality. There's a million little things, like a billion. There's an infinite number of steps if you want to slice it up between even like me moving my hand here and to there. You can Zeno that as much as you want. There's a million little steps, and that's the same thing here. If someone is going to like hand someone else a gun to cause and full well they're gonna go kill somebody with it, there's a million little intervening steps, and it doesn't matter if that there's people like a million people that the gun had to get past to if the outcome is the same. So the question is, it's something else, and the author here is saying it's the foreseeability. How much did you actually know what they were up to? And necessity, like, was it gonna happen? Like, if not even like that you knew it, is that it was like it's going to actually happen anyway once you set this chain of events off. So it seems like this is right. And the thing about the foreseeability, that also kind of tracks the intervening agents that you didn't actually know what was going to happen. Like, you make, you're making stickers and that turns out to be labels for a gun, but you didn't know, like the sticker could have been used anywhere. It could have been used on like a kid's toy and not on a gun. But like as a sticker glue manufacturer, are you responsible for someone getting shot with that gun? Probably not, because there was no foreseeable way that that the sticker contributed to someone buying that gun and then shooting somebody. So there's something there. Now that's really, really shaky, because I don't know how you actually cash out the idea of foreseeability. If you have a good crystal ball, let me know. I could use some stock picks, but like seriously, there's something to this. Like there's an epistemic component here. I don't quite know exactly how to cash it out, but it does seem right that it's not just that there are people like in the causal chain after you before something bad, when something bad happens, that isn't getting tracked back to you. So yeah, so the question then is, who is a civilian? And the question of like loose lips sink ships. Like once you get yourself into like this wartime society, everyone seems to be involved. And so this is the question, like, how far removed are you, and can you be held personally responsible? What's interesting here is the fuel scenario, where everyone is doing like their little part. Where's fuel? So this is the thing. Everyone is doing their part in the war effort. Everyone's got to make, A, B, C. All of us are got a thing, and we all have to make an effort, and the person A is at the end of the line that produces the gun or shoots is shooting at the end of like the causal chain. So what Evolve Yourself was saying earlier is, well, are some people more significant than others? And I was saying also in the same vein, who's replaceable and who isn't? Can like people just be switched around? And once you say, well, look, I'm just a cog in a machine, I can be switched around with everybody, that does make it seem like you are in a group situation. You're all equally responsible because you're all equally contributing to it. But if there's somebody who is more responsible, like someone has like particular skill, like a particularly clever bomb maker, that person seems like they are more responsible than a one person in the rest of the chain. And so that seems like there's something to that there is a salient thing as a salient factor, as Evolve Yourself said. I think there's a more agential response. I don't know if it's salience, but there's something else to that there. And so that's the question, like, is the foreseeability of like, you are the one that is like most responsible for making a bomb, that like in some sense does that increase your foreseeability at that point because you're needed, and does everyone know you're needed, and does that give you greater liability? Maybe. But like, how does that actually happen with foreseeability? See, I don't like this concept of foreseeability. How is like, if everything's coordinated, like the military operation is coordinated, but like there's someone that's doing the coordinating, or there's something there's people that are linchpins in the coordination. How does that work? And I don't know if all of that is foreseeable. Like, how could all of that be foreseeable? It'd be very difficult. So you need like military intelligence to say things like that. But I guess who is a civilian in that case? Because everyone in the civilian stuff is like, you can kill any one civilian. Please do not kill anyone. I'm not advocating killing civilians here. But like if you were to, you know, knock out a random civilian that works in a factory, they can be replaced immediately. They're not going to be critical in the causal chain. Now they may all be responsible. That was the thing about the circle fuel one. Like, no. Once someone is no longer individually responsible, you have to take them out as a group, which is a little bit scarier to stop the whole military machine moving forward. But again, like if someone is just a cog in the machine, like a civilian cog, where, you know, they're pushing paper in some agency far, far away, exactly what is their responsibility, because that won't stop the harm from getting done down the line. Now, I think we just saw in the last few days, buildings are getting burnt in Russia. So they're not, you don't kill any particular person, you knock out a full-on building, and maybe the building is important for harming the Russian military. And that would make some sense. Like, you can't take out a single person if you don't know if there's any single person to be responsible or that is more liable. Maybe the building is. So, or all the information stored in that building. So, yeah, I don't know. It's just I agree with this author here saying, look, it doesn't matter how many steps are in between you. If you're making something that's like intending to hurt someone else, it doesn't matter how many steps are in between you and the harm that comes to an innocent person. That doesn't matter. The question is, did you do it yourself? Was it the necessity? Or did you know it was going to happen? So, like, did you necessitate it, or did you have some sort of epistemic understanding that this is exactly what's going to end up happening? So, and I think the difference here is, like, in the foreseeability, you know someone's going to get, you know that your gun is going to shoot innocent people, and this necessity is you are going to, like, necessitate a particular killing or something like that. So this is basically a very similar sort of thing here. Okay. So I don't think I could do a third paper at this point. If anyone has any anything else to say, let me know now. Can go see if there's anyone streaming I know at this point. Who do